Let me start with a comment on the outing, if you will say, by the Globe and Mail of Toronto's selection as the very likely venue of the G20 meeting in June 2010. I say likely because, of course, the Government of Canada has not confirmed this and continues to say that there may be other possible venues being decided. But I think the safe money is very much on Toronto. You know, as someone who lives and works in a city that is hosting the Winter Olympics in February of 2010, I can tell you that the honor of hosting a major international event comes with some mixed blessings. There are more than a few Vancouverites who are grumpy about the disruption that the Games will bring to the city, not to mention the cost of hosting the event. But there's no denying that the Olympics will be a historic marker for the city, and that it will dramatically and I think indelibly change Vancouver for the better. I would suggest to you that the historic significance of hosting the G20 in Toronto or anywhere else in Ontario is even greater than that of hosting the Olympics. And if you are planning to leave town when the so-called steering committee for the world economy arrives in June of next year, I would suggest that you think again. If you stick around, you will be witnessing, from behind the barricades most likely, that what amounts to, I think, a handover ceremony from the G8 club of the old, if I can say that, industrialized powers, to the G20, which consists of both developed as well as developing economies, including, of course, the famous BRIC 4, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Now, it is clearly an honor for Canada to be hosting this historic meeting, and I should clarify that Canada is hosting in conjunction with South Korea, which will be holding its own G20 meeting in November of 2010. But the honor aside, there should be no mistaking the significance of this event, which in literary terms, I think can be seen as a kind of epilogue to the horror novel that has been the global economic crisis we've seen in the last year. Assuming that we are truly out of the recession by June of 2010, the institutionalization of the G20 at the Toronto meeting can be seen as a kind of denouement to Western or US hubris that nearly brought the world economy to past the precipice. I overstate, of course. But the point is this, that our hosting of G8, G20 is not about Canada's turn in the limelight. Hosting is important, but it's not Canada in the limelight. Rather, it is about Canada in the balcony, above the stage, turning the floodlights to shine on a new set of global players. These new global players are represented by the G20. We're part of the established order that is now making way for emerging powers. To imagine otherwise would be like the line in the Beatles song that goes, "I don't know why you say goodbye, I say hello." At the center of the shift in global power is, of course, China, India, and in a broader sense, the whole of Asia. Now, both China and India are part of the G20, as are Indonesia, Korea, and Australia, all part of a growing Asian community that has become stronger through the economic crisis, even as NAFTA and the EU have, in my view, become less united because of the internal stresses that were brought about through the economic crisis. Think a bit about it. North American integration has stalled. Indeed, it has gone backwards, I think, because of the concerns of the Americans about security at the border, both north and south. And the EU project, for its part, I think it's at its lowest ebb since the Lisbon Treaty, with Eurosceptics on the ascendancy in the European Parliament. And as we know, a few days ago, the recent election of the President of the EU and the Foreign Policy Czar, which brought relatively unknown figures to the leadership of what really should be a major economic and political bloc. It contrasts quite sharply, I think, with the deepening integration and cooperation that we see in Asia that has actually strengthened through the economic crisis. More on that later. When I spoke to the Canadian Club here in Toronto a few years ago, my main message was about the need for Canada to fully appreciate the rise of Asia and to prepare accordingly. Now, 6 months ago when Paul invited me to make this speech, I pretty much figured that I would have to give more or less the same speech. You know, it's the principle that you can't get a message across unless you repeat it many, many times. I don't think that's true now. I think we are beginning to get it. I think there is a consensus emerging that the rise of Asia is real, it's significant, and that it's going to impact on Canada in a very powerful way. But 6 months ago, just 6 months ago, we were still seeing silly articles in the mainstream Canadian media about how the global economic crisis might signal the imminent demise of the Chinese government because of the widespread unemployment that would lead to social unrest and eventually the overthrow of the Communist Party. And can you believe that just a year ago, at the conclusion of the Beijing Olympics 2008, the closing article in the Globe and Mail, the banner headline, was "The Potemkin Olympics." You know, notwithstanding the recent talk about global power shift, there is still a very deep vein of disbelief in this country, and I think in the United States, that there could be genuine economic and material progress in China under an authoritarian regime, and that the people of China could possibly be contented with just material progress. Now, don't get me wrong, I am no fan of authoritarian governments, and we should never forget the horrendous sacrifice of Chinese lives through one failed experiment after another from 1949, liberation so-called, till the opening of the Chinese economy in 1978, as well as the continued suppression of dissent that continues to this day. But you know, the more I think about China, the more I'm inclined to a dialectical view of its recent development. Like many others, I am continually puzzled by the many contradictions in the Chinese economy, polity, and society. And I'm increasingly persuaded at the same time of the durability of these contradictions. Well, a lot has changed in the last year. There's been a transformation in the Canadian mainstream media. There's been a transformation in, I think, popular opinions. There certainly has been a transformation among our business elites and I'll get back to this, among our government leadership. And last week's headline in the Globe and Mail, fast forward to last week, is emblematic of the change that we've seen. Commenting on the Obama visit to Beijing, the headline read, "A G2 of nations dash on China's terms." Now, this too is hyperbole, but I think the message has changed very significantly. Now, I'm not going to go as far as to say that when the globe gets it, Canadians get it, but I do think now that there is widespread awareness of the rise of China in the world economy, India to a lesser extent, and that this power shift is more than just about economics. It is actually ironic, you know, that it has taken an economic crisis to awaken Canadians to the importance of China and India for the world economy. The Chinese economy was the last into the recession and the first out. I mean, one could say that China never went into recession. And it is, in fact, Chinese demand that has kept and is keeping the world economy from plunging into a deeper slump. Indeed, Chinese growth is the single most important reason that a country like Australia has not gone into recession, and in fact that Canberra has recently raised interest rates because of inflation fears. Likewise, Canada has weathered the recession relatively well, in part because of the Chinese economic boom, and particularly Chinese demand for commodities. I am, of course, very sensitive to the fact that the benefits of Chinese economic growth have favored the resource-rich Western provinces to an unbalanced degree, and that the resulting upward pressure on the Canadian dollar has led to the opposite effect on exporters of manufactured goods many of whom are located here in Ontario. Now, while I am happy that the level of awareness about China's importance for Canada has gone up significantly during the economic crisis, I'm not so thrilled about the circumstances of our enlightenment. The commodity boom that is once again fueling economic growth in Western Canada is a rerun of an old movie that desperately needs a makeover. The newfound enthusiasm, for example, of our friends in the oil sands and the natural gas producers to sell their products to Asia is very welcome. And it will likely mean the investment of billions of dollars in pipelines, terminals, and gas liquefaction facilities that run west rather than run south. However, these projects are part of the old extractive industries model that will not do much to prepare Canada for a much different set of opportunities that China will offer in the years ahead. Not just for the Western provinces, but indeed, I think perhaps even more so for Ontario and Quebec. The most important takeaway from the crisis, therefore, is not that China is still growing at 8, 9, 10% a year. It is rather that China and much of Asia has embarked on a shift in its economic development model away from exports solely to one that is driven increasingly by domestic demand. Don't be misled by the blaring headlines in the newspapers about how the US and China are squabbling about the value of the renminbi and that Beijing is resisting the floating of its exchange rate. These are important issues, but they're not the most important issue. The Chinese currency will appreciate in the years ahead, and that will shift spending towards imports. That's a given. But far more important than movements in the exchange rates are the policies that Beijing will have to put in place and already are putting in place to increase domestic demand in China directly through expenditures on infrastructure, education, healthcare, social safety nets, as well as indirectly by reducing the amount of precautionary savings that Chinese households need for healthcare, education, and other social requirements. Now, the need to boost domestic demand in China is usually presented in terms of a global debate that we call the rebalancing of the world economy. This is principally about how to maintain global growth when the United States is reducing consumption for obvious reasons, and as a result, reducing imports from the rest of the world. It's an arithmetic truism that rebalancing will require China and other surplus countries, but principally China, to increase domestic spending in order for the US to reduce debt and to increase savings. Now, China, of course, has an interest in contributing to the rebalancing of the world economy as a responsible stakeholder, the term that's been used. However reluctantly it might be in playing this role as a responsible global player. But China has an even more powerful interest to invest in domestic priorities that have been neglected for many, many years. These include the provision of public health care, rural infrastructure, social safety nets for the millions of workers who have been made redundant by the collapse in export demand due to the crisis. You know, we all understand that successful international policy boils down to successful domestic policy. This is true even for China, which is a one-party state that is top-down in its instincts and which does not tolerate dissent. When Hu Jintao says that China is a superpower and cannot yet shoulder the challenges of global problems, he is not being modest. China faces major challenges of poverty and income inequality, as well as inequality of access to basic services such as healthcare and education. These problems breed discontent, which undermine the legitimacy of the government, which is, when all is said and done, a socialist government that was founded on the promise of social justice. There is therefore a huge incentive, I believe, for the Chinese Communist Party to provide better access to healthcare, housing, education, and to improve the welfare of its citizens, particularly in the rural areas, and to redress the extreme inequalities that are emerging in Chinese society. Now, I'm not predicting as such that this will happen quickly or automatically, but I am saying that the Chinese government will be motivated to work in this direction, not because of external pressure, not because Obama's gone to Beijing, or not because the IMF thinks it should be done, but because of domestic imperatives. Now, don't take my word for it. Let me share with you the results of a poll that I'm in charge of and which was launched in Singapore at the APEC leaders meeting just 2 weeks ago. Every year, on behalf of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, I run a questionnaire to about 400 opinion leaders from around the Asia-Pacific region. And we asked them a range of questions on topical issues affecting the region. Two or three of the questions this year had to do with the rebalancing growth agenda. When we put the proposition to our respondents that slower growth in the Western industrialized economies will encourage a shift to domestic demand growth in Asia, we found that nearly 80% of respondents agreed. And when we put another proposition that China is doing enough to encourage domestic demand growth in its economy, we again had a strong majority of opinion leaders who agreed with that proposition. A third proposition we put was that the global economic crisis will accelerate the pace of economic integration and cooperation. And once again, we found a strong majority at 68% of respondents agreeing with this statement. So I think there is a mood in the Asia-Pacific region that things are happening, change is taking place, and this change, in economic terms, is largely about a shift in the economic model away from solely exports to one that is driven, where growth is driven increasingly by domestic spending. Now, since this is a largely business audience, you may be wondering what a shift in domestic demand in China or other parts of Asia will mean for Canadian companies. This is not the venue to be talking about specific business opportunities, but in general terms, what you should be contemplating is the way in which increased domestic spending power will translate into a larger set of spending categories and in a wider range of markets across China. The opportunities will not only be limited to Beijing and the coastal cities, but will also apply in so-called second-tier cities and well into the inland regions. In particular, there will be rapid growth in the demand for high-end services. In my view, the most interesting Canadian success stories in China today are not to be found in the record volumes of potash or pulp exports that we're selling to the mainland, but in the large and small firms across Canada that are producing services in China in the area of education, advertising, retail, engineering, logistics, food processing, and in many other non-traditional sectors. What is characteristic of these companies is that while they are very much part of Canada's export community, they provide services by establishing a commercial presence in China, with all of the cultural and social challenges and implications that having a commercial presence would mean. And hence, they operate a very different business model from the traditional exporters of commodities and manufactured goods. Ladies and gentlemen, the rebalancing of the Chinese economy will take many years, which means that Chinese exports of manufactured goods will continue to flood the world for the foreseeable future. Canada, hitherto, has not worried too much about the threat from Chinese manufactured imports, mostly because our firms, generally speaking, do not compete in those areas of Chinese exports. And we do not compete in areas of production that are characterized by low wage costs. But one of the implications of the global rebalancing agenda is that the shift in terms of trade to encourage more domestic demand spending will also encourage Chinese firms to go up market. Be careful what you wish for. The same forces that boost domestic demand in China and which create new opportunities for Canadian exporters will also force Chinese firms to innovate and to produce higher-end products and services that compete on a global scale. Competition is coming in a very different way. To cite only some diverse and perhaps idiosyncratic examples, let's think about telecommunications. The Chinese telecoms network giant Huawei has recently won major contracts around the world, not just in developing countries in Africa, for example, that one might say were beholden to Chinese aid and investment, but rather in advanced markets such as the United States, Singapore, Norway, Sweden, and in the UK. And take international education, a field that we are very proud of and which we see ourselves as a global leader, attracting students from around the world, including Chinese students. Well, did you know that China is already a bigger market for international education than Canada is? It is the 7th in the world. We are the 8th. The question is how many Canadians choose to study in China? That's a topic for discussion. And when it comes to an industry very close to the hearts of the Triggs, the wine industry, a subject in which I have no expertise. Did you know that Chateau Lafite of the Rothschild fame has been in northern China, in Penglai, for over a decade, since the late 90s, and that they'll be producing the first bottle in barely a few years? Could China become a major exporter of fine wines? I look to advice from Mr. Triggs and others. But China will continue to surprise us in ways that we haven't thought about. And this will all be part of the same global rebalancing agenda that the West is asking for, which is for China and other Asian countries to increase domestic spending and larger imports. Which brings me to my closing point. Whether Canada is ready for a post-crisis world in which Asia will play a more central role, led by China and India. As you all know, our Prime Minister was in Singapore last week for the APEC meeting and followed by a visit to India. On the margins of the Singapore meeting, Mr. Harper said the following, and I quote, "While Canada's economy was built through transatlantic trade, our future prosperity will increasingly depend on our ties to the Pacific. The region is home to some of the most dynamic and fastest growing economies." While Canada's economy was built through transatlantic trade, our future prosperity will increasingly demand on our ties to the Pacific. This is a fairly dramatic statement, and I'm extremely encouraged that the Prime Minister has said this. If nothing else, it reminds Canadians that we are an Asia-Pacific country and that we are connected, in his words, to the most dynamic and fastest growing economies. But, ladies and gentlemen, declarations, of course, are not enough. And it struck me that there was a sharp contrast between the PM's bold assertion and the relatively lightweight outcomes of both his Singapore and India visits. Now, he will make another trip to Asia next week, first to South Korea and then to the People's Republic of China. And perhaps there will be more significant deliverables and outcomes coming from these two visits. But whatever the results of the Prime Minister's travels, it is extremely important to remember that Canada's long-term success in Asia depends much less on what the PM does over there than on what he does right here. Having articulated the importance of Asia for Canada, he should now work on an Asia policy for the whole of government. The rise of Asia, you know, is not any longer just a foreign policy issue. The rise of Asia is no longer just an international trade policy issue. It is about the whole of government policy. It is about the regulation of foreign investment, particularly investment from Chinese and other Asian countries, many of whom have state-owned or state-linked enterprises. It is about immigration and citizenship, and taking into account the extensive two-way flows of immigrants and Canadian citizens and landed immigrants between Canada and their native countries. It is about building Asia expertise in Canada so that we can participate fully in the debates that are shaping the region. It is about making sure that Canadians have the appropriate language and cultural skills so that they can connect to Asia. You know, for too long, my sense is that Canada's connection to the Asia-Pacific region has rested on two comfortable notions. A, that the west coast of Canada borders the Pacific Ocean and therefore we are a Pacific nation. And B, that there is a significant population of Canadians, principally in Toronto and Vancouver, who are originally from Asia, of Asian descent, and therefore have some kind of cultural connection to the region. Now, these are two important facts, and they certainly do establish a level of credibility for Canada and Asia. But they are not sufficient in positioning Canada as a serious and committed player in the Asia-Pacific region. It's not enough for British Columbia to say that it is Canada's Pacific gateway, which it is. Canada has to say it is part of the Asia-Pacific region, and Canadians across the country have to incorporate Asia into their mental maps. In the same way, our human ties across the Pacific cannot be based chiefly on the relationships that immigrants have with their native countries. That is not enough. Canadians across the country, again, especially young Canadians, should be given the opportunity to consider Asia as part of their educational and career development in much the same way that many Canadians see New York or London and Paris as part of their natural destinations for personal and professional development. At the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, we are trying to get young Canadians to think deeply and seriously about how Asia affects their lives. We are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and one of the things we're doing is a contest for young Canadians between the ages of 18 and 35 to submit videos on what they think are the most important issues in Canada-Asia relations and how these issues affect their lives. We'll pick the top 25 ideas and we'll feature them on YouTube and on our website. Check it out, 25at25.ca. Now, I realize that I'm making the speech some 4,500 kilometers from the Pacific Ocean, and it may be a tad difficult for many Canadians in this part of the country to feel connected to the Asia-Pacific region, let alone the landmass that is Asia. So let me close by making a simple proposition. I have been struck, by the importance of the Great Lakes in the Canadian imagination and how these very large bodies of water in modern times are seen not as separating parts of Canada or separating Canada from the US, but in a sense connecting the US with Canada and connecting different parts of Canada to each other. In the same way, the completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway, now 50 years old, connected the Great Lakes and this part of the country to the Atlantic Ocean and beyond to Europe. I'm not about to say, as Premier Campbell is fond of saying, that the Asia-Pacific Gateway in British Columbia is Canada's St. Lawrence Seaway for the 21st century. That would be too BC-centric for me to use that analogy. Rather, what I would say to you is that the Pacific Ocean is nothing more than Canada's Great Lake to the west. That's all it is. And if we have succeeded in conquering the Great Lakes to the east many years ago, ushering a golden period of business, diplomatic, and human linkages with the United States and with Europe, surely, ladies and gentlemen, we can conquer the Great Lake to the west. Thank you very much.